I just wanted to read, and then I'll bring him in, but I just wanted to read the opening of this article because I thought it helps set it all up very well. On February 24th, as we know, Russian President Putin undertook what he referred to as a special military operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Western bourgeois media immediately decried those stated goals and called any allegations of Nazism in Ukraine basically fake news. Disputing the existence of Nazis and fascists in Ukraine serves the purpose of constructing a twisted but simplistic narrative loosely based on World War II. Putin is the evil Hitler-like figure, and he's attacking the freedom-loving Ukrainian government and its innocent supporters. The goal of such a narrative is to foster blind and unquestioning support for the Zelensky government, NATO, and the imperialist Western powers. A humanitarian, quote-unquote, war, meaning a brutal NATO intervention that would likely spark World War III, is thereby presented as the only viable option. And skipping ahead for a second, understanding all of this background does not imply in the least that one has to support Russian invasion or even assume that denazification is its primary goal. On the contrary, it is possible to understand that fascism is a very real force in Ukraine while opposing Putin's decision to deploy troops and missiles and bombs or what have you. So with that kind of down as the foundation of this discussion, I'd like to bring in Gabriel. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me on, Lee. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, really appreciate it. Thought you did an excellent job with this. And so I just wanted to get into some of the details here and start all the way back in around the era of World War II. 1941, you talk about how Russia and Ukraine really lived in relative harmony before that. And then if you wanted to clear up what happened at that point.
Well, the Ukraine was really one of the central sites for the German Nazi intervention, and at least two important organizations that people should know about, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists as well as the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, collaborated with the Nazi government and participated in what some specialists have accounted for as being 1/4 of all Holocaust victims that were killed in that region of the world. And the members of these organizations, including some of the leadership, were then later integrated into the US war machine as it sought to continue the Cold War, which was the old war, so to speak, meaning the war against the Soviet Union. And the US administration knew full well that the people who were trained and armed to fight communists like nobody else were the Nazis and fascists. And so they then sought to not only protect the leadership of these, their ultra-nationalist Nazi collaborator organizations, but then work with them in setting up really what is an international architecture of fascist militias in order to do some of the most despicable things imaginable, obviously against the Soviet Union. In fact, tens of thousands of Soviets were killed, according to Frank Wisner, the head of one of the members of the upper echelon of the CIA, between the end of World War II and 1953. By these fascist militias.
So that's even after World War II. We know 27 million Russians were killed by the Nazis during World War II, but after, still killing continues.
Absolutely, yeah. And this was, of course, part of the American agenda from the get-go, because the United States had participated in the intervention from 1918 to 1920 against the Soviet Union. And so this warfare against actually existing socialism is a big part of the history, well, of course, of the United States, but then also of Ukraine and the kind of central role that Ukraine played in all of this. And the United States didn't only prop up many of both the militants who were involved and the leadership in these fascist and Nazi collaborator organizations. They brought a lot of them to the United States. At least 20 of them were brought onto US soil. Many others were run in rat lines elsewhere throughout the world.
Right. People really don't know this history of the U.S. bringing certain Nazis, some Nazi scientists, engineers back to the U.S. and, making use of their quote unquote talents. I highlighted the other day how it's now pretty public knowledge that we, wouldn't have gotten to the moon, or at least not then, without Nazi scientists.
Well, yeah, you had Werner von
one
Braun,
example.
right? Yeah, the Nazis, there wasn't just a brain drain, so to speak. There was an international war for the greatest brains behind the Nazi war machine. And the United States, in particular the US National Security State, the Counterintelligence Corps, the CIC, the Central Intelligence Agencies, and other intelligence agencies linked to, Army, Navy, etc., were really intent on headhunting, in the sense of looking for the brightest minds who could perfect the greatest weapons of destruction. And so 1,600 Nazi scientists were brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip and Accelerated Paperclip. And they were not, treated as Nazis. They were given research centers, research assistants, promised nationality. They were set up with their families. They worked with at least 14 major universities within the United States. Of course, many of them including the upper echelons and the Ivy League schools and whatnot. But the 1,600 was really, unfortunately, just the tip of the iceberg, Lee. I mean, they literally brought, I've been trying to get exact numbers, and it's very, very difficult because of how complex the web of relations are. But there were easily tens of thousands of various Nazis, Nazi collaborators, fascists from Italy, as well as fascists from Japan, that were either brought to the United States and kept in the United States, or they're brought to the United States, trained by the Central Intelligence Agency and other intelligence agencies, and then sent back out to do their dirty deeds in the world. Like Reinhard Gehlen, who was one of the, in the upper echelons of the Nazi Third Reich. And then after the war, instead of being prosecuted, he was brought to the US, brought to a Yankees game, actually, with some of the architects of the CIA, and then put in charge of the CIA's equivalent in Germany, meaning the Central Intelligence Agency, the intelligence service of the West German state. And so this whole story, in fact, if your readers and viewers are interested, I wrote a piece for Counterpunch a little while ago called "The CIA Didn't Defeat Fascism in World War II, it internationalized it." And I go into a number of these details. And Ukraine is really central for that, right? Ukraine is one of the hubs.
So to go, hub's a good word. So to go back to Ukraine, can you talk also about the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists? Because I hear that popping up a lot now.
Well, yeah, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, they collaborated directly with the Nazis. And in fact, according to numerous scholars and researchers, they actually did a lot of the dirty work that the Nazis either didn't want to do because they found too heinous, or because the Nazi war machine was always kind of at the cutting edge of the front. And they wanted collaborators who would genocidally eliminate the civilian population behind the advancing troops. And so those are some of the things that the OUN and the insurgent army were involved in. In fact, particularly killing children and doing other such things. And what's important about this story too is some people misunderstand that then the head of this organization, Stepan Bandera, who's now considered a national hero within Ukraine, and we see flags with him on it, etc. He was later arrested briefly by the Germans when it was very clear that they were losing the war. And so some people think, oh, somehow he was against Germany or against the Nazis. No, he was a Nazi collaborator who ultimately was an ultra-nationalist. So he wanted to set up a kind of Nazi-style state within the Ukraine. He did want independence, right? He wanted to lead it himself. But it's not as if he was against the Germans. And the Germans didn't put him to death, didn't put him on trial. He was a good collaborator with them.
And hilariously, recently, as our mainstream media likes to hold up these Nazis or neo-Nazis as the heroes right now in Ukraine, one great example was PBS interviewed one of the mayors of one of these towns, and he had a Stepan Bandera portrait behind him that they blurred out, thinking people wouldn't be able to figure out what it was. So when you're in the business of blurring out the Nazi portrait behind the guy, you might want to question who it is you're praising.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, the Nazi blurring out has been intermittent because there's a really important whitewashing campaign that's going on right now in not only the mainstream media, but there's an entire network of international PR firms that are trying to whitewash this history so that the Ukrainian government and the various battalions that they work with can be presented as the freedom fighters, right? We know this from past conflicts. And that has meant that some of these organizations have toned down some of their Nazi rhetoric, calmed down with the swastikas, et cetera, because they're getting advice from these PR firms that basically work directly in hand in glove with the US government and the NATO allies and all of that. But when you dig a little bit beneath the surface, the relationships are very, very clear, and they've actually been sustained for years and years and years. Douglas Valentine, who's one of the greatest specialists on the history of the CIA, has written that the CIA has been running fascist assets in Ukraine for 70 years. They've been developing an entire network. And so we also have to see through the kind of whitewashing attempts now that are just trying to get people on board with another war, another NATO intervention, and other such things.
And so let's talk a little about NATO, how they've been involved with this over the years. And you talk in your article about Operation Gladio. Can you discuss that?
Operation Gladio is something that I think everyone should know about. And there's actually a good documentary available on YouTube that I think was made by the BBC or another channel in Great Britain. And it was a NATO operation, the lead up to it was Operation Northwoods that wasn't enacted, but it was planned. And the plan was to commit acts of terror against
this was planned by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Pentagon.
Exactly. Yeah, and it was green-lighted by all of the upper brass within the U.S. military and national security state. And it's Kennedy who had some qualms with it and decided that they shouldn't pursue it. But we have the documents with a stamp of approval by all of the top generals involved.
Saying they would kill people, innocent civilians in Florida, and blame it on Cubans. So it would have been our own government creating false flags, killing our own citizens, and blaming it on Cuba to justify an invasion.
Absolutely, including the potential use of domestic aircraft, right? And sabotage attacks like this. So people have raised questions about its relationship to 9/11, obviously. As far as questions are concerned, I think it's a very good question. I don't know the answer to it, but then once this operation was shut down, one of the people, General Lyman Lemnitzer, who had overseen it, became then the head of NATO command and basically implemented what had been Operation Northwoods in Europe under the name of Operation Gladio. And Operation Gladio, in a nutshell, was the result of the Central Intelligence Agency and MI6, which is the British intelligence service, worked with NATO, but behind the backs of the majority, at least, of the governing officials within European parliaments and other governmental institutions, in order to set up, to recruit, train, and establish what they called stay-behind armies, or the idea was that these would be armies of fascists and Nazis that would stay behind enemy lines if the Soviet Union decided to move further westward, and then they would commit acts of sabotage and terror against the Soviet Union. That didn't happen, of course. So what they did instead is they used this fascist underground army. Daniel Ganser's book, NATO's Secret Armies, is excellent on this topic. And they redeployed them. So this was in every NATO country. There was basically a parallel system of fascist militias that were not overseen by the governments of these different countries, but overseen instead by the CIA and MI6. And they began in the strategy of tension in Italy, is perhaps the most clear case of this, committing acts of terror, the most heinous acts of terror really in the modern history of Europe, against the civilian population, blaming them on communists and socialists, and using them as an excuse to go after the communist parties and socialist parties, do enormous crackdowns on the left, and then force the civilian population to support law and order governments and basically vote in right-wing candidates who said they were going to clamp down on this communist agitating and this communist terror campaign. Incredible.
And this was the 1960s?
Yeah, 1960s and 70s. It came to light, actually, just so that people know, because when I say these things, sometimes people think, wow, Rockhill's a harebrained conspiracy theorist or something along these lines. There has been, the European Parliament has a resolution on Gladio in which it recognized that it exists, that it did exist, and in fact that there should be further investigation into its contemporary existence. And it went to the high courts of Italy, and the high courts of Italy found that there was a clear existence of Gladio. Gladio participated in these terrorist campaigns, and the leadership can be drawn, the lines can be drawn all the way back to the US national security state.
Yeah, so you have that going on, and in some ways hasn't stopped. I mean, it kind of has morphed into other maybe sometimes less extreme versions. But so talk about Adolf Husinger. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, Heusinger. If we're on
Heusinger.
German
Okay, yeah.
TV for what it's
Not
worth.
not not up on my German. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we have to worry about it too much. But the one of the important things is, so these secret armies that I was just talking about in Operation Gladio, this was a NATO project, right?
Yeah.
So NATO was directly integrating fascists and Nazis into these militias. And we have certain members of the militia that admitted to their involvement. But they also, NATO, integrated some of the Nazi leadership. So Heusinger was the chief of the general staff of the army under Hitler, under the Third Reich. What did he do in the post-war era? Was he brought to trial at, Nuremberg? Was he incarcerated? Was he put to death? No, he was instead recruited by the US and became the chairman of the NATO military command. And he served there from 1961 to 1964. He's also not the only, high-ranking member of the Third Reich and the Nazi Reich that was then integrated not only at a low level, but into leadership positions like Werner von Braun that you brought up earlier. Hans Spiedel is another really interesting example. He was a German general and then oversaw some of the rearmament of Germany in the post-war era and was in charge of the Allied Land Forces Central Command and worked for NATO, right? So this is also a very important part of this history from the point of view of, obviously, the Soviet Union. And Russia today is not part of the Soviet Union. It's not a communist country. It's a capitalist country, etc. But they know this history, or at least parts of this history, which is really important to understand, that the NATO expansion eastward is the expansion of an army that has been working with the most heinous elements of the Nazi and fascist regimes in order to kill communists and socialists, shore up capitalism, and guarantee imperialism, US-style imperialism around the world, really. But obviously, NATO does a lot of its activity in the broader kind of Eurasian area.
So then to jump a little closer to today, there's the 2014 US-backed Maidan coup with kind of neo-Nazis as the force behind it, the energy, the most violent contingent in that coup, correct?
Yeah, it's important that these, this was a U.S. supported operation, of course. Victoria Nuland actually bragged about the U.S. pouring $5 billion into the operation. And it's really, I think, an interesting operation, and one that's really important to understand for people in the West and more generally, because it was an operation that aimed at supposedly supporting these nonviolent protests while actually aiding and abetting fascist and they're just Nazi battalions within the Ukraine that were committing acts of violent crime, harassing anyone on the left, and also running harassment campaigns against political figures and other such things. And so the Maidan coup was really a kind of US-backed faux democratic movement that was actually really driven by a lot of militant fascist battalions on the ground that were funded by the US and also funded by other kind of major capitalists within Ukraine as well.
And so that sparks off fighting in the Donbass region that's gone on ever since then. You talk in your article about how 14 or 15,000 people have been killed in that area. So in their view, for a lot of the people in that area, they don't feel like this war started a month ago. They feel like it's been going for 8-9 years now.
That's exactly it. And it has been, right? 14,000 people it's a project of allowing a lot of these battalions and working with them, because they were what some people will call, it's a slightly academic term, but I think it's helpful, parastate organizations. Right? So you have state organizations like the Ukrainian Army, National Guard, et cetera, and then you have parastate organizations, which are vigilante bands of militias that work in parallel to the state. And then some of them have been integrated into the state. And if people know their history, this is exactly what the Nazis did. It's exactly what the fascists did in Italy, is they have these parastate militias that do the dirty work. And then depending on the circumstance, they're often integrated then into the state. And so the Azov battalion, which is a Nazi battalion, is now part of, or at least parts of it are part of the Ukrainian National Guard. And the conflict that's been going on in the Donbass region is, 14,000 people have been killed. The Russians consider this genocidal or of a genocidal nature. And so the situation in the Donbass region is largely driven by Russian separatists who, once there was this US-backed fascist coup, decided they didn't want to be part of a fascist government in spite of its attempts slightly later on to kind of whitewash itself, present itself as democratic and liberal and whatnot. They preferred to be a bit like Crimea and be part of Russia. And so the conflict has not only been simmering, but it's been, more or less boiling for years. And of course, now it's the pot is boiled over, so to speak, because obviously we're at a higher level of intensity than we were prior to the Russian deployment of troops.
And your article gets into probably the most common defense put forward, at least on Twitter, et cetera, when people point out there are strong Nazi elements in Ukraine. People point out that our media is holding up as heroes, Nazis and Nazi sympathetic forces. They go, well, no, that can't be because Zelensky's Jewish, therefore all else can't be true. There are no Nazis in Ukraine, which you get into how Zelensky ended up in office. And if you can talk more about that, but also how ridiculous it is that just because they have a Jewish president, that means that these Nazi forces aren't there.
Yeah, thanks for bringing this up. It's really one of the, unfortunately, most ignorant positions that's floating out there on social media, and it's also all over the mass media and the corporate media. The idea that one could not be fascist if one is Jewish is, well, it's reductivist, it's culturalist, and it's just frankly untrue. As many people who have studied Israel know full well, there's not some type of recalcitrance of Jewish people or Jewish faith or anything like that to the forms of fascism. And it depends, of course, on how one defines these elements. And the history of Nazism, of course, is bound up with various forms of anti-Semitism, but a very big part of their anti-Semitism was an attack on what they called the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. And so they weren't going after some of the Jewish bankers who actually were involved in funding some of the Nazi rise to power. And the Jewish ruling class, some of them did escape. They were going after the working class, and in particular, the insurgent working class, and they identified a lot of the Slavs of the East and the Soviet Union with this Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy on Western civilization, the Aryan race, and capitalism, right? So when we talk about fascism and Nazism, one of the single biggest mistakes is to simply look at culture and ideology and not look at the economic forces that are driving these ideologies. And so Nazism and fascism are pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist projects that mobilize different scapegoats, and they identify different targets at different points in time. The Jews have been one of the major targets. There's also been a lot of other targets. And so more specifically, if we talk about the Ukraine, one of the incredibly important, not details, but flagrant elements for people to know is, Zelensky comes from a Jewish family, vaguely identifies as Jewish, and so does Ihor Kolomoisky. Kolomoisky is the single biggest backer of Zelensky, financial backer. Kolomoisky is, I believe, about the third richest man in the Ukraine, although he doesn't currently live in the Ukraine. So he's one of the so-called oligarchs, the Ukrainian oligarchs. Who else does Kolomoisky fund? He funds the Azov battalion, the Nazi battalion, one of the major ones that I was just talking about that has been integrated into, or parts of it, into the Ukrainian National Guard. He also funds other battalions like the Adar battalion that's also well known for being fascist. He spent $10 million to create the Dnipro battalion. And so here you have a Jewish oligarch and a Jewish president who, on the one hand, the oligarch is funding, right, these Nazi and fascist battalions because they're getting the work done that he wants to get done, which is crushing the Russian separatist movement, moving the ultranationalist position, etc. And Zelensky has been aiding and abetting these forces, both symbolically and materially, right? So we have to recognize that.
And in many ways, Kolomoisky created Zelensky as a national sensation because he funded the TV show that was a huge national hit. But part of the reason it was a huge national hit was because it was on Kolomoisky's television media networks so much. So he basically created, or at least funded the TV show, put it on all his networks, put it on all the TVs. This guy becomes hugely famous. He then funds his campaign.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And in fact, in digging deeper into it, if you look into the Pandora Papers, these two individuals, the Ukrainian oligarch and the actor turned president, and we should know, of course, that the role that he played in this famous TV series is as the president of the Ukraine, who's an anti-corruption president, like an everyday man.
And that's what he ran on, right? Anti-corruption and peace.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And so looking back on this TV show, given the fact that Kolomoisky funded it and also that it ran on one of the TV channels that he has, he has ownership shares in, we can see this almost as an extended ad campaign, right? Of what would become then the next president. In fact, the name of Zelensky's party, Servant of the People, is the name of the TV show. So this is a remarkable case of a PR operation that functions really at the highest level. And, it's not that funny, but it is ironic that now you have Zelensky really playing the president who's trying to portray himself as freedom-loving, pro-democratic, etc., and making these appeals for the NATO intervention and whatnot, and trying to basically make reality appear something that it's not, right? And so the PR campaigns and his role as actor continue to this day.
Kind of a quick side note I was curious about if you know much about it. When Zelensky addressed Congress on the large video screen, he had a T-shirt on with like the Iron Cross that has been associated with, some say associated with Nazism. And then I guess at the end, Nancy Pelosi said the current slogan of Ukraine, which is "Glory to Ukraine," which also has a Nazi history, correct?
Yeah, my understanding of the history of that slogan, at least, is that it comes out of the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and is a longstanding kind of ultra-nationalist appeal on the part of then these Nazi collaborators. So there's a way in which then you have, of course, and you saw a lot of this on social media, people pointing out not only the kind of irony, but the laughable ways in which the U.S. administration is bending over backwards in order to try to support Zelensky. Of course, there are some limits to that, fortunately. The cross, I'm not sure of the whole history, and a lot of these symbols, over time they get appropriated by different forces and resignified. So it's sometimes difficult just to draw a monocausal line and say, oh, well, it all comes from this. Right. So I'm not certain on that front.
Yeah, it could very well be that, the Nazis or the Azov battalion, for example, become powerful in the Ukrainian military. So they influence it to adopt the slogan, and others then begin using it, not necessarily connecting it to its past. But yeah,
exactly.
So I guess one part we haven't hit on yet is kind of the U.S. Congress connection to this. There's a lot, such as the funding and arming of these people over time. The U.S. Congress has put it into bills. They even removed the ban they formerly had on funding and arming neo-Nazis. They made sure to take that out. I didn't know if you wanted to address kind of the impact and work of the U.S. Congress in all this.
Yeah, or the U.S. government more broadly, right?
Yeah, broadly, yeah.
Yeah, there's the funding in relationship to the Azov battalion. It's been in kind of fits and starts, but the House of Representatives recognizes that it's a neo-Nazi, or at least they did in 2015. That it's a neo-Nazi battalion, and they were kind of fine with funding it. There have been fits and starts since 2015. Basically, the U.S. government trying to run cover for itself because they don't want to have too much egg on their face when the broader public knows that they're funding Nazis. But there's also another part of this story is the training of these battalions by the Central Intelligence Agency, actually bringing them to the United States, running training camps, sending them back then to Ukraine, and also then overseeing and helping in the training of fascists really from around the world in the Ukraine, and running training camps there precisely for that purpose. In fact, in one of the studies that I've looked at, there have been some 17,000 fascists who have gone to the Ukraine in the span of like 5 or 6 years from, I think it's 50 different countries, to train with these fascist battalions. And so this is also a really big part of that whole story, is not just the funding and the military support, but the direct training and working with these various fascist forces.
So I guess we're wrapping up here. What have I missed? Have I left anything out?
Let's see, what else do we have? You know, another part of this story is that I think it's really important for people to recognize that the Biden administration came in on amongst other things, a kind of anti-fascist ticket, at least insofar as Trump was identified by a lot of liberals as being, proto-fascist or fascist, choose your term, and that Biden was going to be the last bulwark who was going to save our democracy. Well, as soon as you look internationally and you don't have the parochial perspective of someone who just concentrates on US politics, you have to recognize that this is a classic bait and switch that the Democratic Party has done for decades and decades. And where it presents itself as democratic, it attempts to run PR campaigns to prop up the Zelensky government and the various battalions that it works with as being forces of democracy and liberation, while in fact on the ground there are actually very clear examples of the manifestation of fascism. And so you have people who are supporting Biden on the home front, but yet being kind of pro-Ukraine in the sense of advocating for a NATO intervention. And it really should come into focus for people that if you want to be anti-fascist, you have to be internationally anti-fascist, right? Which basically means that you have to be anti-imperialist, and you have to recognize that NATO, with the US guiding light in, being the guiding light in NATO, is one of the primary imperial forces in the world today. And so we have to fight fascism on the home front and fascism abroad. We need to be internationalists in this struggle.
Thank you. Well said. I highly recommend your article. I'll put it in the chat as well. And where can people follow your work?
Probably on my website, GabrielRockhill.com would be the easiest. You can find me on Twitter. My handle's the same. It's my name. And I'm involved with some great organizations as well. This came out with Liberation News, which I highly recommend people check out. Yep. I also work with Liberation School, which has a great platform.
Thanks so much. I hope you are able to keep doing your work, and I hope people don't try and ban or cancel your stuff.
Yeah, same here. And I hope that you are able to survive in these difficult times of direct censorship and the attack on basically, creative investigative journalism that's outside of the mainstream. And so, yeah, I really support the cultural production that you're doing. Keep it up.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gabriel. Talk soon.
Thank you. Take care, Lee.